They say some spirits are born of the storm, that they enter this world not with a gentle breath, but with a crack of lightning in their soul that no man can tame, a tempest in their heart that no chain can ever hope to hold. At the Blackwood Ridge Stables, a place that smelled of damp earth, old leather, and quiet desperation, that untamable spirit had a name, Aries. They called him a demon, a shadow, a killer cloaked in the magnificent body of a black stallion. His was a legend whispered over weak coffee in the mess hall, a cautionary tale told to new recruits. He was a creature so violently shattered that the only mercy left for him, in the eyes of the army, was the clean, cold finality of death. But this isn't just a story about a horse. It's a story about the nature of scars, the jagged ones we can see, and the invisible ones that reshape our souls. It's about how the deepest wounds are often inflicted not by enemies, but by those who were supposed to protect us. What if the only person who could truly understand a monster was someone who was secretly fighting his own? This is the unbelievable story of how a wounded soldier, a man discarded by the world, did what seasoned masters had declared impossible. He didn't just approach the unbreakable horse. He recognized him. Before he was a condemned legend, he was a masterpiece of breeding. Aries was destined for glory, his bloodline a carefully curated map of strength and courage, meant to carry generals into battle. But that destiny was derailed in the most brutal fashion. The official story, the one the stable owner, a man with tired eyes and a ledger to balance, recited to inspectors, was a neat and tidy tragedy. A freak storm, a fallen oak branch, a moment of pure, unpredictable panic, an accident that left his first owner dead and the horse irrevocably damaged. Aries, they concluded, was driven mad by the trauma, his mind fractured beyond repair. But truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. The men who worked the stables, whose hands were calloused from hard work and whose faces were lined with things they'd rather forget, knew a different version. In the dim, smoke-filled light of the barracks, they whispered of a different kind of storm, a storm of human cruelty. They spoke of the former owner, a man whose wealth couldn't mask a core of pure arrogance, who believed a spirit was a thing to be broken with force, not earned with trust. Rumors claimed he used whips with braided wire and spurs sharpened to a cruel point. The real story wasn't one of a horse gone mad, but of a creature pushed beyond endurance who finally, justifiably, fought back. The stable, terrified of a scandal that would taint its prestigious reputation, buried the truth along with the man. So Aries was branded a killer. He became a ghost in his own life, a prisoner in a reinforced stall, and every attempt to reclaim him ended in explosive, terrifying chaos. He wasn't a horse anymore. He was a monument to failure, a dark stain that had to be erased. The army's patience had worn thin, and the ink on a fatal order was about to dry. But a new arrival at the stables, a man as haunted as the horse, was about to challenge the official record. Sergeant Elias Vance arrived at Blackwood Ridge like a ghost in broad daylight, not with a hero's fanfare, but with the quiet, determined shuffle of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The war was officially over, but for Elias, it was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of the world. His left leg was a stubborn monument to his service, forcing him into a slow, rhythmic limp, a visible, daily reminder of a past he desperately wanted to bury. But his most profound wounds were the invisible ones. They resided in his hollow eyes, which held a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look straight through people, and in the profound, guarded silence he wrapped around himself like a shroud. He was assigned to Blackwood for light duty, a clinical military term for being put out to pasture. It was a place where the army sent its damaged equipment and its damaged men. Mucking out stalls, mending fences, and the smell of hay and dirt was a world away from the thunder of artillery, and that was the point. He was an outcast, and he wore the title with a quiet resignation. He ate alone, he worked alone, his presence barely registering with the other men, who saw his silence not as strength, but as a symptom of weakness. The official report on his injury was a masterpiece of vague heroism, but the whispers that followed him from his last post told a different tale. He was a puzzle no one cared to solve, a broken soldier in a stable full of broken horses. He was just looking for a quiet corner of the world to wait for his own war to end, but he was about to find its epicenter staring back at him from inside a locked stall. The first encounter, a silence louder than words. It happened on his third day, under a sky the color of slate. A sudden commotion shattered the afternoon's quiet. A series of panicked shouts, the splintering sound of wood, and a terrifying, enraged scream that wasn't human. Near the isolated enclosure at the property's edge, a small crowd had gathered. Inside, Ares was a whirlwind of black fury, a living storm of muscle and fear, kicking at the thick oak beams of his pen until they groaned. His eyes were wide with white-hot terror, his teeth bared. The other men kept their distance, some nervously gripping pitchforks, their faces pale. But as Elias limped towards the chaos, drawn by a force he didn't understand, he saw something else. Through the dust and the fear, he didn't see a monster. He saw a mirror. He saw a prisoner, trapped in a cycle of terror so profound that its only language was violence. Ignoring the sharp warnings from the stable hands, he stopped at the fence. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his stillness a stark contrast to the chaos. The shouting and panic slowly fizzled out, replaced by a tense, confused hush. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the inevitable charge. But it never came. The great horse's frantic movements slowed. He stopped kicking. Panting, he turned his massive head, his nostrils flaring, and his wild eyes fixed on Elias. There was no aggression in the soldier's posture, no challenge in his gaze, only a deep, unwavering, and familiar sorrow. For a long, breathless minute that stretched into an eternity, the man and the horse simply stared at each other, two silent survivors locked in an exchange no one else could comprehend. The other soldiers saw it as madness, but it was a conversation, and it was about to change everything. That single, silent encounter lit a fuse in the damp, gossipy atmosphere of the stables. The whispers about Elias began to weave themselves into the dark legend of Ares. The two outcasts became a single, unsettling topic of conversation. It was a mystery that was far more interesting than polishing boots or mending tack. The half-forgotten rumors about Ares's first owner were resurrected with new, vivid details. "My cousin's friend was a farrier here then," one man claimed in the mess hall. "He said the owner had a special set of spurs made, sharp as razors. Said the horse's flanks were always bleeding." Suddenly, the narrative began to shift. Maybe Ares wasn't born a killer. Maybe he was made one. This new speculation fueled the fire of suspicion around Elias. A soldier passing through from his old unit brought fresh gossip. "He didn't just freeze," the man whispered over a shared bottle. "He put his whole squad at risk. The only reason he's not in a cell is because his old man's a colonel." The story morphed and grew with each telling. Elias wasn't just incompetent. He was a coward, a fraud whose heroic injury was a lie designed to cover up a deep character flaw. He and the horse were now inextricably linked. A man accused of cowardice and a horse accused of murder, both trapped by narratives they couldn't escape. With their fates hanging by a thread, Elias knew he couldn't stand by and watch another innocent spirit be condemned by lies. He had to act. The order arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a stone-faced corporal. It was formal, signed by the base commander, and utterly final. Ares was to be euthanized at dawn. A grim sense of relief settled over most of the men. For them, it was a necessary evil, the closing of a dangerous chapter. For Elias, it felt like an execution order for a fellow soldier, a soul he knew was innocent of the crimes it was accused of. That evening, as the sky bruised from orange to deep purple, Elias made his choice. He moved through the stables like a phantom, his purpose a silent, burning fire inside him. He ignored the sharp command of the stable master to stay away from the enclosure. He crossed the muddy yard, his limp a steady, determined beat against the earth. He didn't hesitate. He unlatched the heavy gate, the cold metal a stark reality in his hand, and stepped inside. He was weaponless, his hands empty, a wounded man walking willingly into a condemned monster's den. The few who saw him were paralyzed with a mixture of horror and awe. This wasn't just insubordination. This was suicide. Ares stood in the far corner, a silhouette of tense muscle against the dying light. He watched Elias approach, his body a tightly wound spring of suspicion and fear. A low, rumbling growl started deep in his chest. Elias didn't stop. He moved slowly, deliberately, never breaking his calm, steady gaze. He stopped a few feet away, his vulnerability his only shield. And then he raised his hand, not to strike, not to command, but with his palm open in a universal gesture of peace. The air was electric. Ares could have lunged, could have ended this madness in a blur of hooves and teeth. Instead, after a long, heart-stopping moment of assessment, the great horse took a single, hesitant step forward, and then another. He lowered his massive head, and with a shudder that ran through his entire body, he gently touched his nose to Elias's outstretched hand. In that moment, a bond was forged, not of dominance, but of mutual surrender. It was an act of trust so profound it would rewrite history, but it would also ignite a new, dangerous war. The event became an instant myth, but it didn't bring peace. The base commander, a man who saw the world in black and white, was enraged by the blatant insubordination. He was forced to postpone the execution, but his fury festered into suspicion. He couldn't accept this miracle because it didn't fit within the rules of his world. A new, more insidious conspiracy took root, nurtured by fear and jealousy. He didn't tame it, an officer declared to a captive audience. He's connected to it. The man's mind is as broken as the horse's. It's an unholy alliance. The narrative shifted again. Elias was no longer just a quiet outcast. He was now seen as unstable, a man whose damaged psyche had somehow resonated with the animal's savagery. Their connection wasn't a sign of healing. It was a symptom of a shared madness. Despite the hostile stares and the isolating whispers, Elias persisted. Every day, he spent hours with Ares. He wasn't breaking him. He was listening. He found a spot behind Ares's ears that made the horse's eyes go soft. He learned the low, gentle rumble Ares would make, a sound of contentment no one had ever heard before. In tending to the horse's wounds, Elias felt his own begin to close. The tremors in his hands lessened. He started sleeping through the night without the familiar ghosts of the war visiting him. The two of them, man and horse, began to heal each other in a silent partnership that the rest of the world could only watch with suspicion and fear. But the true nature of their bond was a secret far deeper than anyone could possibly imagine. The truth arrived not with a thunderclap, but in a sealed envelope. A letter from Elias's former captain, a man finally moved by a guilty conscience, laid out the whole, unvarnished story of Elias's injury for the base commander to read. It was not a story of incompetence or cowardice. It was a story of radical, forbidden compassion. During a brutal, chaotic firefight, a terrified transport mule, struck by shrapnel, had bolted directly into the kill zone, carrying life-saving medical supplies. The standing order was clear. Equipment, even animal life, was expendable. But Elias, seeing the animal's sheer terror, refused the order. He broke cover and ran under a hail of fire, not to attack the enemy, but to reach the frantic animal. He calmed it, shielded it with his own body, and led it back to safety, saving the precious supplies. In that act, a bullet tore through his leg. He was written up for dereliction of duty, for risking the mission for what his superiors called a stupid animal. They buried the truth in his file to avoid the official embarrassment, leaving his reputation to be devoured by rumors. His scar wasn't a mark of shame. It was a medal for a kind of courage they didn't recognize. And in that moment of revelation, the commander, the soldiers, everyone, finally understood. Elias had looked into the eyes of a condemned horse and had seen his own reflection. Ares was not a killer. He was a survivor who was punished for defending himself. Elias was not a coward. He was a hero who was punished for an act of profound mercy. They were two souls who had been brutalized by a world that mistakes compassion for weakness and self-preservation for aggression. They were both survivors of a war fought not on the battlefield, but against a world that had tried and failed to break their spirits. We call things unbreakable when we lack the courage to understand their scars. Their story forces us to ask, how many monsters are just heroes whose stories have never been told?